All right. Well, thank you all for coming. This is the first Diversity and Equity Committee Lunch and Learn for 2022. We're super excited to kick off this new year with a presentation from Move Minnesota. Move Minnesota is a transportation advocacy organization. They're going to talk a lot about what they do and how planners can be involved in their work, how you can bring this back to your community. But we want to thank them so much, Alyssa and Sam, for being here. These lunch and learns, they happen the first Thursday of every month. So if you want to add that as a recurring event on your calendar, they happen at noon, the first Thursday of every month. I didn't have the foresight here to pull up our schedule for the next couple of months, but there is one every single month for the next few months, and a lot of cool organizations and people coming here to talk about projects that they're working on that have that equity impact. I will put the small sales pitch is that as of 2022, all AICP planners will need that equity credit as part of their reporting. So this particular session does not have that equity credit, but in the future, our sessions will. So just something as you think about planning for your CM credits, this is a great and free way to do this. And I see that Andrea shared our upcoming lunch and learns in the chat. So if you want to take a look and add some things to your calendar, I really encourage you to do that. And then finally, I just want to give a big thank you to Stantec. They sponsor this series. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sam and Alyssa to give us a presentation.
Thank you, Peggy Sue. I think we'll start by both just introducing ourselves. And as we go through this, we do have a couple spots throughout the presentation. We have a slideshow presentation where we have deliberately carved out time for questions. But I would also say, go ahead and just jump in. We'll try to kind of keep an eye on the chat. If there are questions that are going on, maybe I can keep an eye on the chat when you're talking, and you can keep an eye on the chat when I'm talking, Alyssa. We haven't planned this out. I think that having this be kind of organic would be great. We'll cover some elements of the transportation system kind of broadly, some overview, talk a little more in depth about transit, talk about the impacts of both transit and the transportation system on all of our lives and society, and then talk about some of the work that we do as an organization. So my name is Sam Rockwell. I'm Executive Director of Move Minnesota. We'll talk in a moment about what we do. I also do some teaching at the University of Minnesota. I see some of my students here who it's the first time they've seen like below my nostrils. So this is what my whole face looks like. I used to be the president of the Minneapolis Planning Commission. I'm not a planner by training, but intersect with MERPs and with planners in a lot of different arenas. Alyssa.
Thanks, Sam. My name is Alyssa Schachmann. I use she and they pronouns. I am the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Move Minnesota. I likewise do not have a planning background. I came to advocacy as a person who uses our transportation system and wants to see it better. I do a fair amount of volunteering work. I'm on the Minneapolis Bicycle Advisory Committee, as well as the board of Our Streets Minneapolis, which is a local Minneapolis specific transportation advocacy organization, which is where I live. So care a lot about this work as a person who just wants to get around safely and in sustainable ways.
And we work for Move Minnesota, as I noted, and Move Minnesota is an organization that both connects folks to transportation options when they work well and advocates to make those options better for people when they don't. So that first part of our organizational mission, connecting people to transportation options when they work well, is part of our work as a TMO, Transportation Management Organization. We are the Transportation Management Organization for the City of St. Paul. Some of you probably work with TMOs. And so we are funded from the federal government through the Metropolitan Council to do that work. But too often, it is hard to ask people with a straight face to embrace transit, biking, and walking if those systems are not safe, not adequate. And so we are also constantly working to improve those systems through advocacy work at the Capitol, at city halls, with our counties, Metropolitan Council, and building movement to build out those systems that put people first.
We are an organization that is focused on transit, but we recognize that all forms of sustainable transportation really work together to provide people with that transportation network, right? People don't just use transit. I myself am a year-round cyclist. I get on the bus when the weather is awful. I really hate biking in the rain. So I need the biking system to work and I need the transit system to work. People change modes all the time. And so we work with partners who are focused on some or all of those sustainable ways of getting around. We lead a coalition of statewide partner organizations, calling on the legislature to increase funding for bus, for rail, for bicycling, for walking. That's called the Transportation Forward Coalition. And then we also work with partners who aren't focused on transportation as their main issue. We have a Mobility Transformation Advisory Board, which helps us craft and clarify a transformative vision for the future of transportation in our state. And those are partners who work in racial justice, who work in housing, who work in disability justice, those intersections where people are really impacted by access to high quality transit, biking, and walking. So that's a little bit about who we are. Now let's talk about why we are here. Building towards justice, right? We want our transportation system to be joyful, to be sustainable, and to be connected, and it's really part of that for Minnesota. So with that, we'll jump into the presentation. We will start by taking a minute to talk about how we got here. Next slide. So I think, when we look around at the infrastructure of our public spaces, it can really seem like cars have been here forever, that they're sort of inevitable. But when we put it in context, it's really easy to see that that's not true. Cars are a relatively recent development in our history as human beings. As a society, we've been walking for thousands of years, and the car is only 135 years old. It's a relatively recent development. Next slide. Despite that context in history, right, most people drive to get around, and most people take that status quo for granted to the point where they don't even think about it, right? We're often establishing patterns or following patterns we've established as teens. We don't get up and decide like today is the day that I'm going to do to drive to get groceries, right? They go the way that they've always gone, which is most of the time driving. And these patterns are shaped by our surroundings, by our transportation system as a whole. Next slide. It's not just in the Twin Cities, but that's pretty true across the state of Minnesota. We have extraordinary sunk costs in car infrastructure as a state. We have the 4th highest road lane miles in the country, which is disproportionate to our state's geographic size, which is in the teens, and our population, which is in the 20s. And it's been going up. But a year ago, we were 5th, and now we're 4th. Next slide. Why do we move this way, right? As we just saw, it's not because we are inherently drivers as people. We existed without cars for thousands of years. It's because we've designed and funded our transportation system, our network of streets, of bus lines, sidewalks, curb cuts, parking, all that stuff to encourage all of us to drive. And we continue to sink more money into more lane miles, and we've locked ourselves into the cycle of doing so. Our state constitution mandates that we spend billions of dollars on highways and on the state aid system, while we spend just a really small fraction of that on transit, biking, and walking. Next slide. Thanks, Sam. I think we like to think that building all of that road infrastructure is solving for something, right? Most notably congestion. But in actuality, I think we need to pause and know that people respond to their environment, right? We can't build our way out of congestion because people respond to their environment, and that highway expansion often makes existing problems with climate pollution, with air quality, much worse. So this graphic, which is cycling through, shows something that many of you are probably familiar with, induced demand, right? So it shows how when we expand highways, people who drive are drawn to the open road, and it fills back up until it's as congested as it was before we expanded the highway. There's this really common metaphor in planning engineering where we talk about traffic flow, right, as though people are like water, but people are not water. People make choices about the trips that they take and they respond to the context that they're in. It's pretty intuitive, I think, when you pause and think about it, because people generally do not choose to drive in places where there are not roads, and they drive when there are. So we've encouraged this massive amount of driving by continually expanding our highways. Next slide. This is a tough slide. Our car infrastructure comes at a cost, right? The interstate highway system, when it was built in the 1960s, really enabled white flight to the suburbs. And at the same time, the highway construction itself was destroying full neighborhoods and full communities. These communities were often communities of color, and often the decision to destroy those communities was explicit, it was deliberate. We talk a lot about the Rondo community in St. Paul and the construction of I-94, which destroyed Black homes, Black businesses, and Black wealth. Next slide. All of this leads to an incredible waste of resources, right? Space is one that's really easy to see on this slide here. But there's also this opportunity cost, right? There's space that we could be using for housing when we have a housing shortage, for parks, for local businesses and restaurants, for schools, for daycares, right? And when we don't have enough space in the places that people want to live, it forces them to live elsewhere. Next slide. And it's not just the transportation decisions that got us to where we are, right? All of you well know that transportation and land use are very linked and they influence each other. There's this interrelationship where roads encourage people to drive further. There's this sort of forced expansion because there's no place for people to live. And then as people are living further away, we build more things further away, right? So we have to think about things like single family zoning, which was invented around the same time as the rise of cars, right? And it was explicitly created to make it more difficult for people of color to move into white neighborhoods. We also have to think about racial covenants in housing, which were used in Minnesota, across the United States, to keep Black people and other people of color from purchasing property in the areas that white folks considered desirable, right? It forced those folks, Black folks and people of color, to cluster their homes near highways, and continues to be linked to poor health outcomes related to air quality near highways. We have to think about redlining, which was that creating of a rating system that gave preference to neighborhoods with those racial covenants in place, and said that areas where people of color were living were hazardous, and so those folks couldn't get loans, right? So all of that housing stuff intersects with with our history of transportation and how we got where we are. And then we also have to think about the highway lobby, right? So as highways and the interstate system, the roots of that go back to the 1930s. Folks like General Motors, AAA, other industry groups were coming together, and they, wanted investment in highways, and they basically invented the concept of freeways, right? Free roads, using the word free, to convince the public that roads were self-sustaining and roads were free, right? So there continues to be this misperception even today that like roads pay for themselves when they don't. Similarly, we still have a highway lobby today that continues to spend money on cars and getting people to buy cars at astronomical rates. So you can see here that the US auto industry spent $286 million on digital advertising, just digital advertising in just Minnesota in 2019, right? That's a huge amount of money to influence people's buying behavior. So all of that together, right, continues to create those communities and this cycle where people keep living further away from each other. They become more dependent on cars. We build things that are only reachable by cars, and it just goes on and on and on. Next slide.
All right, I think it's kicking over to me now for a little bit. So we're going to delve in a little bit more on the impact of transportation. Alyssa walked through some of that and how we got here. But when we think about our transportation system today, it really is central to so much of our daily lives, right? And it's central to how our communities function, and the opportunities that we're able to access. So part of this is, particularly in cities and towns, is because it just literally takes up a lot of our space. So if you're in a kind of a center city type of land use scenario, it's pretty common for your transportation network, your streets, your sidewalks, boulevards to take up, 30 to 40% of the actual land use, right? So it's an incredible percentage of the land in your community. It also then determines how you are able to access opportunity, what the health is in your neighborhood and your zip code, how long it takes you to get places, and so on and so forth. So we'll walk through some of these. We're going to start big and then work a little bit smaller. So in addition to these pieces that influence our daily lives, transportation is the #1 source of climate emissions in the United States, and also in the state of Minnesota. And we have seen this play out both in our climate and in our health. The majority of the transportation emissions, looks like our star got moved there in a shift of slide formatting. The red star is supposed to be on the transportation bar. Majority of this comes from cars and light-duty trucks. So the majority of our carbon emissions come from transportation. The majority of those transportation emissions come from the cars and trucks that are driving around on our road. And we know that in order to address those emissions, we need to shift how we move, right? So electric cars, we hear a lot about electric cars, and electric cars are vital to achieving a climate sustainable future. But when we look at both the rate of emissions reduction that we need to achieve, and we look at whether or not we can achieve that kind of emissions reduction with justice in mind, we have to be able to provide alternatives as well. So first, the timeline. The timeline is constrained by how well we make our cars and trucks these days. So there's something called a replacement cycle, which is essentially how often you have to replace a given durable good. And so the replacement cycle for cars and trucks is between about 17 and 20 years. That means that if you buy a car today, it's still going to be on the road 15 years from now, right? And so in order to have 100% renewable transportation on our roads in 2050, we would have to be selling 100% electric vehicles in about 7.5 years. Right now, we sell about electric vehicles account for about 2% of the vehicles on our roads. So in order to reach those emissions targets, we need to reduce how much we're driving. And we've done a lot of analysis here, both on the state level, nationally in other states, and in some of our local communities. So what does it mean? It means we need to reduce how much we drive by, in the state level, by about 20%. VMT, vehicle miles traveled, reduce our VMT by about 20%, which MnDOT has a preliminary goal there, which reflects research by groups like the Rocky Mountain Institute, National Research Association. Minneapolis and St. Paul both have determined targets for their center cities relative to the state targets. So we're going to have a different kind of strategy and a different level of VMT reduction depending on the community type. And we have also seen these kinds of targets in states around the country, increasing research in this arena. And then the second piece is how we get to the kind of transition, a clean energy transition that we're hoping, which is a just transition, right? So an electric vehicle, just as much as an internal combustion vehicle, is a threat to people on our streets, right? We see that, and we see that this threat, which plays out in injuries and deaths, is disproportionately distributed among our population. So our Black, Brown, and Native populations suffer significantly higher from traffic deaths, related deaths, than their white counterparts. In a large part, that's how we have designed different kinds of streets and how we have paid attention to our design considerations in different communities around our state. And this is going up as these injuries are going up as our vehicle miles traveled are going down right now. We've seen in COVID reduction in the need to drive, and we have also, with people working remotely, and we've also seen an increase in the number of traffic fatalities. We actually saw the largest increase, 5%, in traffic fatalities in 2021 since 1924, which is pretty bleak. And so we're seeing just how much we have to think not only about providing alternatives for driving, but restructuring those streetscapes to keep our communities safe. Also, as we think about a just transition, we have to think about what it does to people's pocketbooks. Transportation is our second highest household expense. Housing gets a lot of attention as our most expensive household expense, as it should. But transportation has an incredible impact on other opportunities. Here we can see, and these are numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that the annual household cost of owning a car is approximately, on average, $9,500. And that is more than expenditures on healthcare, household expenditures on healthcare, entertainment, and education. It's more than we spend on food. And so you think about the kinds of opportunities that can open if we are able to provide access to opportunities and an ability to navigate our communities if we did not have to be car reliant. But most people don't take these other forms of transportation right now because you can't access so much of our communities. These are maps out of the accessibility laboratory from the University of Minnesota, which show just how unequal access is by a couple different modes. On the left, we see access by automobile in the Twin Cities region, and the kind of the reddish purple there that covers almost the entire metro region, almost the entire area within the 494, 694 Beltway. Within that region, folks are able to access between 1 million and 2.5 million jobs in 30 minutes. In the map on the right, the yellow area that you can see just at the core of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and a little bit shaded along what we know as the green line in between the two center cities, is an expression of being able to reach 100 to 250,000 jobs within 30 minutes by transit. And then it just gets worse from there if you're not in the center cities. And so we see there's just an incredible disparity in access to opportunity, not just in jobs, but in access to social opportunities, cultural opportunities, educational opportunities, healthcare facilities, you name it, in access, period, depending on how you're traveling. And of course, the ability to travel by car, we should not be making that the default, should not be taking that for granted because it is so expensive and so harmful. Alyssa, over to you.
Thanks, Sam. As we think about these really macro effects, right, the full scale of the impacts of our transportation system, I think it's really important to come back to remembering that it is ultimately about people, right? It's about communities, it's about people's day-to-day lives, it's about giving people access to living joyfully, sustainably, to be connected with their friends, their family, their communities. Take Mary Jean here, who needs access to bus service. She can't drive anymore, and transit helps her maintain her independence. Next slide. Or Katie, right? Katie relies on the bus to get to work, and when the late bus routes were cut in her community, she was faced with the choice of being stranded without a way to get home or to risk losing her job. That's a choice that we force people to make under our current transportation system, and nobody should have to make that choice. Next slide. This is a quote from Lane, who has been living at a sober complex in St. Paul and has been sober for 2 months. Congratulations to Lane. Lane was on the way to get a cell phone and doesn't have access to the Metro Transit app. And so some changes in the schedule meant that Lane spent more than an hour just trying to get a basic need met. Next slide. And this is from Laura, who contacted us because the cancellation of a bus impacted students and faculty who are scrambling to find a way to get to campus from St. Louis Park to complete the semester and take their finals. Next slide. And our transportation system as it stands disproportionately disadvantages people in our communities who rely on transit, right? Those are essential workers who disproportionately rely on transit, people of color who disproportionately rely on transit, people with low incomes, people who are too young to drive or too old to drive, and people who have physical disabilities, like Matt here, who uses transit to get around. We often talk about how disability parking often equated to disability access for people, and disability parking isn't useful for people like Matt, but transit is. So we have all these stories, right, from delays on transit to dangerous or fatal car crashes to all of these day-to-day impacts that are really making it harder for people to live their lives. And we have them because we made driving a car not just the easiest and the most obvious choice, but the only choice. It's functionally the only choice that most people have for getting around. And we've also made these other ways of getting around into third-rate options, walking or biking or using transit. So I think I would love to pause here because these are the kinds of things we talk about, the things we hear about when we are out in community. But we would also love to hear from you if there are things that you are hearing. You know, you're planners, you talk to people, you're engaging with community, and I'm interested in hearing if there are stories that emerge for you, there are themes that you encounter often in the process of your roles as we think about some of these macro and micro, right, these personal and these global impacts for people.
And people can feel free to unmute and put on your video if you want to add to the conversation. I know there was just a question in the chat, which I'm not sure if we want to answer now or answer later, but just about how developers often build what cities permit. So, you know, demanding cul-de-sacs or arterial roads that, you know, if cities built smaller or required kind of smaller setbacks or green spaces, that developers would build that. So how do planners advocate for better built environment at the local level? Do you have any recommendations on that, Alyssa or Sam?
I think it's you know, it's really about building support with the elected officials, frankly, because as those policies come up, you know, it's important that those elected officials are the ones passing them, right? I mean, when we have an actual change in the zoning that's needed, you can't do that unless like the zoning gets changed, and that's a legislative action. And so I think it's about building those supports with the electeds, and I think that comes through a lot of education, right? It's education of those electeds, and then of course it's education of the constituents. And I think, you know, to Alyssa's point a minute ago, you know, all of you are out in the community as part of your jobs. You are doing community engagement as part of your jobs, and part of that job is as an educator. And as an educator of the importance of a change in zoning or of a change in transportation, infrastructure or policy to all of these cross-sectional issues, right? Because I think people see transportation or people see housing as these kind of wonky things and not about fundamental to public health, fundamental to access to education. I noted a minute ago that I teach land use law at the Humphrey School, and I flagged a legal issue this morning and saved it in my folder for next year's class, which is that the state of California has passed a law that requires non-single family zoning, right? So you've got to allow multiple in areas near transit. You got to allow up to 4 units, I think, on a lot. And there is I think it's called Wooddale, California, has weaponized the Endangered Species Act to say that we can't possibly allow multiple units on our lots because mountain lions live here. It's not going to happen. We got to protect mountain lions. So Scott Wiener, the author of the density bill, had kind of a snarky tweet this morning. I think that the mountain lions weren't threatened by mansions, but apparently are threatened by fourplexes. So, I think that you think about a dynamic like that and you say, well, this is not just about doing that kind of legislative advocacy or advocacy with your city council, but you've really got to bring the folks with whom you're engaging along with you on the importance of these issues, not just as kind of a wonky, bureaucratic, technocratic thing, but as really fundamental to the health and safety and future of our communities.
I'd be curious, kind of building off of that, we had that conversation, with our council around reduction of parking and really planning for the future. And that can be a really hard conversation when it feels like, you are struggling to look for parking. And it doesn't seem like everyone is really invested in that behavior change. So how do you have those conversations when people feel like that's planning for too far in the future and it doesn't address prejudice?
I think I think one of the things, anybody else jump in, you probably are all more experts on this than I am. But I think one of the things that that I would respond to is that, admitting that it is hard. But how else are you going to get to that future that we need? That transition periods are really hard. I think being honest with people is important. And not sort of writing those concerns off. I think it is difficult. But also we know that people are willing to walk long distances. They just don't think about it, right? I spoke at an event related to bus lanes the other day on Hennepin Avenue, and everybody's losing their mind about the fact that we might lose parking spaces on Hennepin Avenue, and we will. We will lose parking spaces on Hennepin Avenue if we have a bus lane. But also, nobody's losing their mind about the distance they have to walk to a store in the Mall of America for the parking ramp. That's the equivalent of like 7 city blocks. So we have to kind of think about, are we basing expectations on something real or just on what we know today and we can't really envision change? And I think trying to contextualize that a little bit in a way that, that sort of draws some of those analogies, and also trying to make changes to these larger systems that is fairly quick, right? In that the benefits to increasing density, for example, or having increased transit is not from increased density on one lot that benefits a couple people, or a faster transit line that also benefits a couple people. But really, it's about that systemic change. And so the faster we can engender that systemic change, the better. So if you're going to build one bus lane, build 20. And I'll use San Francisco as an example. San Francisco has painted 13 miles bus lanes since COVID started. They just said, we're changing the system. And it's really, and they kind of push things through, and they're doing community engagement with those pilots in place and are now turning them permanent. So they put them all in place as emergency transit lanes. And now they're doing community engagement where people can actually see them in place. You can't do that with housing. You can't build a house and then be like, it didn't work, knock it down. But you can do that really a lot with transportation.
Great. We have a question in the chat that says, when discussing these topics, there's often a block to people's imagination. Some folks struggle to imagine not using vehicles, having denser areas. This results in failed efforts or obstacles. What strategies do you use as advocates to combat this?
I think I might put a pin in that question because that is a good question. And and we're going to get a little bit to like how some of our work is trying to move some of this stuff forward. And so what I might do, Alyssa, is there anything you want to put out here? Otherwise, we might do a little bit more presentation and circle back to some discussion.
I think that's good. There's some other thoughts I have that I can talk about later.
All right, we're getting a lot of questions, which is good. So we're going to plow through the rest of this and then get into discussion. But we'll give a little bit more context, which I think might provide fodder for additional conversation and might answer a couple questions. We'll see. All right, I went all the way back to the beginning, apparently. Wait for it. Whoop. Up, roll transit. Okay, so so I think, if everyone can continue to think, I think about your experiences of how transportation system impacts your work and what you hear, right? Alyssa was sharing quotes from folks who have reached out to us, who we've contacted through our community organizing efforts on the ground, transit campuses, and so forth. And I think that those stories are really powerful, and hearing some of those from you when we get back into discussion would be wonderful. Before that, we did want to touch a little bit more on transit specifically. We talked kind of broadly about the transportation system. We do a lot of our work in transit. And, as was kind of alluded to, or not alluded to, as was directly addressed in several of the slides, transit is really a key component of kind of the process of solving for some of these issues, addressing some of these issues, right? Having an annual transit pass is like $1,400, and having to pay for a car is $9,500. So therein lies a solution. A solution, if we have a significantly better transit system in a metro area, and it doesn't just have to be the Twin Cities metro area, to allowing people to reinvest that money, right? Transit significantly cleaner and can be electrified, a fact that is entirely depressing, but that I also like to point out is that we had a comprehensive transit system that was entirely electrified in the 1930s. It was an electric streetcar system that carried 230 million rides a year, compared to our current kind of diesel based system. And there's some hybrid buses too now, which carries 80 million a year. So we have had a fully electric transit system. We can improve those climate outcomes. We can improve the particulate matter outcomes, health, so on and so forth. So where are we now, and where are we going with our transit system? Well, right now we have a few different systems. This is what Metro Transit in the Twin Cities is calling the Metro system. Let's get right to the point, naming this system. And the Metro system is our core, what they consider our core lines, right? So this is LRT, light rail transit, and BRT, bus rapid transit. So this is what we have right now. This is not the sum total of our transit system. We also have local buses, and we have suburban buses. We have the North Star train. And the local buses can be divided into what Metro Transit calls a high frequency network, which are core lines that run more often throughout the day, every 15 minutes or better at noon is the definition, and non high frequency lines. But this Metro system is kind of the core system, and it is also the basis for what Metro Transit sees as the long-term system. So this is Metro Transit's Network Next map from their Network Next plans. And Network Next is their vision for a fully built out bus rapid transit system. So this is what they are envisioning as the future of the system, some distant time. They do envision having a fair amount of this built out by 2040, if we get more revenue. So that's something. Now, is there support for this, right? So we just talked a little bit. There were some questions about, how do we build support? Is there support? I mean, the reality is there is support for this. This is polling from across the United States that that Transportation for America, which is a national group, has done. And the vast majority of people in this country believe that public transit is critical. And for folks on this call who are probably, who are definitely more kind of in the know than most on all of the multiple jurisdictions we have going on in Minnesota, you'll know that Metro Transit is part of the Metropolitan Council, which is actually a state agency, although it is a regional governing body. And then you'll know that a lot of our core bus lines are on county roads. You'll know that Hennepin and Ramsey County are funding much of our rail, and that the cities have a little bit to do with transit, but not that much to do with transit. But even in the cities, the number one thing that folks care about when they think about the future of our transportation system is transit. This word cloud on the right is from the Minneapolis Transportation Action Plan engagement. And then across Minnesota, folks also see biking, walking, and transit as the key to a sustainable future. And this is from a MnDOT statewide community engagement effort around a report they call their Pathways Report. So there's an incredible amount of support for building out a different system. And because of all that support, Move Minnesota, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, but we are pushing for something significantly bigger and different than what Metro Transit is proposing, and really building out a substantially different system. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. But this kind of system, as I alluded to a minute ago, is possible. It's what we've had, and it's what we can have again. We know it's possible, and so we're working to get there. We'll talk a little bit about that advocacy work in a minute. But before that, we're going to talk about what our advocacy work has to focus on, because it's not all easy. There are a lot of challenges. Over to you, Alyssa.
Thanks, Sam. I'm going to fly through this section, both because I want to leave time for discussion and also because it's kind of a bummer. There are a lot of barriers to progress, right? When we think about, we know what we need to change, why don't we just change it? There are a lot of things that we need to be working on. So first, as I noted at the top of the presentation, we have state and federal laws that mandate that we spend money on roads and on highways. And even when we do have that flexibility in funding, we see that most local jurisdictions are choosing to spend as much as they can on cars and highways and as little as possible on transit, biking, or walking. And as you all well know, the way we design our infrastructure can be a huge barrier too, because of the time delays, right? Projects are planned decades in advance. It makes it really difficult to pivot. And then we have projects that are how our streets are for 40, 50, 60 years before people are really considering finding ways to change them, right? Retrofits are not that common. And our planning processes don't really help either, right? Our public engagement processes have historically, and in many cases continue, to favor a small segment of the population, typically more rich, typically more white, typically more folks who own homes, to the exclusion of those perspectives of the folks who are more marginalized and tend to be more reliant on transit, biking, and walking. And in addition to that, Minnesota loves its cars, right? We have all those road miles, and our car culture is really strong here. Next slide. This is my favorite slide. This is maybe Sam's favorite slide, right? Car culture is strong here because it's strong everywhere in the United States. We have all these investments and structures that reinforce car culture, and our narrative, right? Our narrative in the United States really centers cars. You can see on this slide, people associate cars with independence, with daring. Taking a drive is an activity. Road trips are like a cool thing to do with your friends, right? Getting your driver's license is a rite of passage. People expect that from you. The second you turn 16, they're asking, when are you gonna get your driver's license? My spouse's favorite show, Top Gear, is on this slide, and I don't know how many hours he has spent watching a show about a bunch of guys doing dumb things in cars, right? Cars are this assumed part of our cultural story and way we connect with each other. And this is the narrative soil out of which our planning processes, our spending patterns, our choices about our transportation system is growing. It shapes our understanding of not only what's possible, but also what's desirable. Next slide. As I already mentioned, this strong culture means that we invest in cars and highways while we're not investing in transit, biking, or walking. I'll speed through this one. Next slide. And then we don't use the flexibility we already have at a lot of different jurisdictional levels. So folks can take a look at this when we send out the slides afterward, and certainly welcome questions about it at that point. Next slide. This one I'll pause briefly on because we also have policies and laws that support and favor cars, right? We invented the crimes of vehicular manslaughter and jaywalking because when the car was taking over our public spaces, drivers killing people was becoming a huge problem. So we came up with a term for it, motor killings. And then instead of solving the problem, we made it less legal for people to walk and decided that killing someone with a car was a special exception of some kind, which is really ridiculous and insulting, frankly, to say that our legal framework okays the fact, like it's more okay to kill someone as long as you do it with your car. Next slide. So as we consider all these barriers to change and how we overcome them to move towards something more just, more sustainable, it can feel really overwhelming to imagine this like wholesale transformation of our transportation system. But it's useful to think about the fact that we've already seen a wholesale transformation of our transportation system when we adopted cars, right? In just a few short decades, cars went from a relative novelty to something that is a standard part of people's daily lives that really shapes our infrastructure. So as we think about what is possible, we know that when we make those massive realignments in our priorities and our investments, we do see people's behavior change as a response. Next slide, and I'll turn it back over to Sam.
And it's not just backwards looking, right? Knowing that we've done things before, but we know we can do things now. So there are increasingly great visions for what our communities can look like. And there are examples of transformations that have happened, not just in putting cars onto our streets, but on giving street space to people and to these more equitable forms of transportation. And we know that this applies to communities all across the kind of size and typology spectrum, right? That you can have a community in where Peggy Sue is sitting in Hopkins, which is bikeable, walkable, and creating more space with projects like the Artery, core cities in like Minneapolis, smaller communities around the state. And we are working advocacy initiatives to make some of those changes as well. I'm just going to give a quick summary of some of the stuff that we're working on. You saw our map from before of what we're trying to achieve in terms of the kind of core regional transit system. It's not just about a map, it's about how it functions, right? The goal is that we have a quality system that is traveling significantly more frequently. We have budgeted out a system that would operate every 5 minutes during rush hour and 10 minutes, no longer than 10-minute frequency on that core system on non-rush hour times. And that is comparable to places that have significant transit ridership in the United States. We have, pinpointed walkability to the system as a whole, not just to an individual line, as critical. A system that can roll out quickly. So the system that we have envisioned is a bus rapid transit-based system, and that functionally improves the lives of folks who are currently riding the system, and is attractive to people who might consider using the system. Again, it's a transformation, and these are approximately to scale from the map at left, which is what we have now, to the map at right. And as we've noted, this is doable. We also are working to move forward a variety of plans that are in existence for Greater Minnesota and biking and walking. There are detailed plans from MnDOT and the state statewide biking plan, walking plan, pedestrian plan, and we are advocating at the legislature for money for biking and walking in the metro area as well. We also are doing work to make our fare system more fair. Right now, it's a misdemeanor if you don't pay your fare on transit, and of course, if you don't pay your parking ticket, if you don't pay for a parking meter when you're parking somewhere, it is just like a parking ticket, not a permanent criminal record. And so we are working to shift that legal framework, which then also allows for a shift in who is able to do fair checks, and it would not need to be the police. And so there are a variety of kind of equity considerations, both in terms of what the punishment is and who is on our buses and trains. We're working to make changes now in an initiative called Boost the Bus. There are things that we can do that are shy of bus rapid transit that are incredibly impactful. We talked about bus lanes, signal priority, giving green lights to buses on our city streets. Those are things that can happen at the municipal level. And they have an incredible amount of impact. We've seen bus lanes and signal priorities separately improve speed of buses from everything from 15 to 25%. We're seeing this roll out around the country. We are also working on initiatives to reduce vehicle miles traveled related to the MnDOT initiative. For our client, there are a variety of state planning processes which we're trying to influence. And I won't go into it right now unless people ask me in the chat. And then there are both kind of the big picture and the very local, where we're also working as well. The big picture is there are massive amounts of federal funds, which I'm sure folks have seen in the wherever you get your news. I was going to say in the newspaper. I'm an old soul. I still get the newspaper delivered. And so we're trying to make sure that those are used in the most sustainable and equitable ways for our future. And then we're also working on kind of specific project-based initiatives, trying to make sure that a given project, a given street is constructed, reconstructed, rethought in a way that is beneficial for everybody. So with that, we breezed through the rest of that, and we still have a couple minutes for questions. But I do say maybe I'll turn it back over to you, since you were looking at questions.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good commentary in the chat, which if you are, not paying attention to, I really recommend people to go through and read. I'll just bring us back to Ben's question that you mentioned that we kind of put a pin in, which is, some folks struggle to imagine not using vehicles or having denser areas, which results in failed efforts or obstacles. So what strategies do you use as advocates to combat this? I don't know if you have more that you'd want to expand. And then we had a comment here of which comes first, dense walkable development or transportation options?
Alyssa, I kind of
chicken or the
ran
egg?
my mouth in the last questions. Do you want to
No, it's fine. I was just jumping in to answer some other things in the chat. Yeah, I think I want to get both of those questions on my screen. And there's a lot going on in the chat right now, which is really great. I think that going back to what Sam said about temporary or demonstration projects, right? When we think about people's imagination, often they just need to see it, right? And the idea that you can put something in that's more temporary to assuage people's fears or concerns around the fact that you're changing their community without their input in a permanent way can be a really powerful way to say hey, we're going to try something. We would like you to experience it and then give us feedback on it, rather than sort of get into that conversation where people are preempting you and saying, well, I haven't experienced that, therefore it is not appropriate for my community. I think that's part of it. And then also just continuing to the best of our ability, telling those personal stories about how things have worked, whether that's here or elsewhere, right? I really like to talk about the brief time I lived in Japan, and everyone age 5 and up walked to school, even in the country, right? Kids walked 40 minutes to school every day. And it was really cool. You would see 5-year-olds partnering up with the 10-year-olds, and they'd all be walking to elementary school together. And that's just normal there. And so I think the more we can continue to talk about the fact that those are normalized experiences in lots of different places, the more we can help people realize it's not as though every child in Japan is subject to traffic violence as a result of walking to school, right? That's just a great thing that they have decided is a priority. And so they have made it possible for kids to do.
That's great. There's a great question in here that I love of many projects still use vehicle level of service this as the main priority. Are there quick, easy, and easy to understand levels of service for walking, biking, and transit that we could be focusing on instead?
I think there's probably two, one, which I see used a lot, which is not just for bike and walking transit, but just for transportation. It's just person throughput. And that, as we saw in a slide earlier, this incredible amount of people can be on our transit in particular. And so when we think about giving a green light to transit, for example, you are benefiting an incredible number of people, but it's only one vehicle. So when we have a level of service metric, the bus gets almost no weight. When we have a person throughput, it gets more weight. I think that also then flows into how we think about bike and walking and so forth. That's the one I've seen really put forward there.
So you're imagining the ways that planners can kind of use that quantity of people rather than necessarily the level of service of how much car traffic that's going through a street, but really thinking about it in terms of volume of people.
Right. Is it the person that you're measuring, or is it the vehicle that you're measuring? Right. And that makes a big difference. Obviously, not obviously, maybe I should say that I think we should be using other metrics as well, like emissions and how many people are getting injured by it in a particular way in a corridor. But that kind of blows. That's not an alternative corollary to a level of service.
Yeah, we have another question of. Oh, no, go ahead, Sam.
I was just going to add on the imagination question really quickly. I think because all of you are planners, I think planners have a really big role to play in this imagination question too, which is creating plans. People are able to imagine in the abstract things a lot better, right? So City of Minneapolis, for example, has a really strong transportation action plan. And the city council in Minneapolis, almost unanimously passed it. Now, as we get down to the details of project to project to project, it's going to get bloody battles. But I think having a plan framework is really valuable. So thinking about that. Sorry, go, Peggy Sue.
Yeah, I was just going to say there is another question about the point about false equivalencies is really helpful to see articulated here. This person is wondering if there's a way to help visualize that hierarchy as grounding for these types of conversations, or do they already exist? And Alyssa put in here something from 2040, but I don't know if you want to take a second to expand on that.
Yeah, and I should say, so that was a response to, someone asked a question about trade-offs, right? And the thing I put in the chat is that part of the role I think we have is to call out that false equivalency that our processes encourage, right? It is not equivalent to say a travel delay of 20 seconds is the same as reducing traffic fatalities, right? Those are just completely different things, and yet our processes encourage us to equate those things. So there's certainly, as we think about complete streets, so the link I put in the chat is to the reference to the complete streets policy, which has a modal hierarchy, which I think can be one useful frame in that conversation. But I think a lot of it is just, making a judgment call in those conversations and continuing to sort of question those underlying assumptions of how our processes work and what they encourage us to prioritize.
Great. Well, it's 1 o'clock, so I just want to be mindful of people's times and just give the opportunity to say thank you so much, Alyssa and Sam, for coming here and sharing your work with us. We are so excited to continue to support the work that Move Minnesota does. So please send out your information. We'll send out your information in your slide deck to planners, and please sign up for their emails, stay abreast of the work that this organization is doing. It's really great. And our next Lunch and Learn is going to be on 3/3, and that is going to be a presentation from Housing Link. They're going to talk about their research data that they have and how planners can be using their proprietary data. So thank you again, Alyssa and Sam, for your time today.
Thank you all.